The French government nationalized its electrical utility, EDF, today, and that prompted some interesting conversations on social media amongst economists. And one of them caught my eye. I'm going to be talking to Dr. Chris Bataille, who raised the issue of what should government in Canada own in the various electricity systems across the country. So welcome to the interview, Chris.
Hi, Markham. It's good to be here today.
Well, good to have you. Now, let's set a little bit of context here. So there is power generation, there
Mhm.
is transmission, so the lines taking the power from the generator to the market. Then there's the distribution system. Then there is retail. So sort of four parts to an electricity system. And in most of Canada, those are owned almost entirely by the Crown Corporation, Crown Utility, BC Hydro, Manitoba Hydro, Quebec Hydro, and so on. In a couple of provinces, Alberta and Ontario in particular, there is some competition. Some of it's more regulated than others. It gets pretty complex. But so the question remains, what, if anything, is there a role for government in owning some of that infrastructure? And maybe let's talk first about what's going on in France. Give us a little sort of taste of your argument around why France did what it did and what that means for government ownership.
Right. Well, this goes back in history a little bit for France. The EDF the electricity production company in France, it has a very large nuclear fleet that's coming up for renewal, provides a big part of the investment. It's been trying to build new large reactors. That's been taking a long time simply because a lot of the people who built the older fleet have now retired. There wasn't a lot of investment in between. And it's just gotten the amount of capital required and the time frames required to get the job done in terms of keeping the French electricity system are now basically beyond EDF's capacities as a private corporation. So the French state has come back in to own it and capitalize it and make sure it can do its job.
Okay, interesting. So the EDF owned all four of the parts of the electricity system that I described earlier?
Effectively, yes. It was a national company before. It was somewhat privatized, and now it's being brought in.
Okay, so it's like a Quebec Hydro for
Right.
all of France. Okay, gotcha. Now let's talk about Crown corporations, which is most of the provinces, and let's take BC Hydro. So you and I have had interviews in the past where your modeling and modeling of many other economists says Canada has to increase power generation by 2 or 3 times by 2050 to deal with electrification of the economy.
Right.
BC Hydro is building one more dam, Site C, and then says it won't build any more dams after that. The question arises, where will that power come from? Will it come from the private sector? And you can see that argument maybe in other provinces like SaskPower, like in Saskatchewan, maybe not so much in Quebec, but in Ontario. So should the private sector provide all incremental power generation going forward?
Okay, so rolling back a little bit to answer the question, there are parts of the electricity system and other parts of the energy supply system that are what we call natural monopolies within our energy economics, and it's just these things that cost less and less per unit delivered the larger they get until there's one. So imagine if you had 3 electric companies competing to provide you with electricity, but they all had to provide wires to your house. That makes no sense whatsoever in terms of for all sorts of reasons. So we have one system of wires, right? But you could have several companies competing to provide your electricity. And that's exactly what happens in Alberta. And it happens to a certain extent in Ontario. In the other provinces, it's more of what we call a vertically integrated monopoly. So there's a big power generator. It owns the generation units. It owns the transmission. It owns the retail system. And so in BC, we just deal with BC Hydro. There are some smaller producers, but they sell their power to hydro. It's fundamentally different in Alberta, right? Where there's an arm's length provincially owned agency, the AESO, that effectively manages the grid and in private companies sell power on an hourly or an hourly basis into that grid. Now, moving forward in time, as we try to expand the electricity system, the problem of the natural monopoly of the grid is just going to get harder and harder to deal with. So really, it makes sense for government to hang on to the grid and provide the long distance transmission to the big dams, what have you, in between the provinces, own the retail system. But the logic of natural monopoly does no longer applies to generation. So in the past, coal plants would get bigger and bigger, hydro plants would get bigger and bigger, nuclear plants would get bigger and bigger, until it made sense just to have one, and you might as well have the government running it, owning it, but then there would be a utilities commission that would decide what was the fair price to charge the consumer. With this going into the future, the cheapest electricity is likely to come from wind and solar, but it's going to go up and down with wind and light and what have you. And you're going to need some sort of backing system. So on an hour by hour basis, the power that's sold you might be wind and solar, but as you rotate through the seasons of the year, night and day, weeks, there might be for a while, there might be a gas turbine system operator that sells you what power you need, or a nuclear operator or what have you. But it's beyond government to try and manage, what individual unit should be providing that power at any given point in time. Let the private sector bid in at the lowest cost, but they sell into the government grid system that then provides it to you. If that makes sense. I'm sure you have questions.
I do, many of them, as I'm sure viewers do as well. So in a case like Alberta, you could continue with the lightly regulated market there, and power generators, if they're qualified, can develop wind and solar farms or geothermal plants or whatever it is that they want, and then they have the right to connect to the grid. And that all gets managed by an independent system operator. So that kind of model, then the government would have to come in and basically buy the wires, essentially.
Well, this is where it gets interesting, right? Because if you develop say you developed a new solar field or a new wind field, there's a certain amount of transmission that has to be built to get that power from that field to the main transmission system, right? And that's where you need to establish rules. Is it the new entrant that has to pay for that transmission and gets added to the grid, and then they sell their power through it? Or is it government that does it, and then they charge back to the generator when they supply? Either system can be used, but you need clear grid management rules for that to happen.
Right. So the requirement for clear policy and regulation, I think that's we'll call that a given. But in Alberta, continuing to use this model, but it probably applies to Ontario as well. The government doesn't currently own the wires. So how would it acquire the wires? Would it nationalize the wires?
The wires are held within effectively, it's a provincially owned agency. It's a provincial. So at a remove, the Alberta government does own the electricity system or governs it.
Okay. No, sorry. This is a wrinkle that I wasn't aware of. Could you explain how what government agency owns the wires in Alberta?
Yeah, I believe it's the AESO, the Alberta Electricity System Operator.
Okay.
Does in Ontario, it's a different layered system of grid operators. But the key thing to remember is that they are there makes no sense to have multiple systems, multiple transmission systems. You only really need one. So whether or not it's owned by the Alberta or Ontario governments, or if it's owned privately, its rate of return has to be governed by a utilities commission, because otherwise, because they're the only provider, they could crank up the price as high as they wanted. And you want to have the efficient, what's the cost of providing that transmission service? And that gets passed through to the consumer through the utilities commission and gets paid to the provider of that system.
Gotcha. So if I understand this argument correctly, Chris, whether the government actually owns the wires or it regulates the wires through an independent regulator, you get to the same outcome, which is
you get to the same outcome. Yes.
Okay.
The key thing is there are many different, many different generators competing to supply your power at a given point in time, but it makes sense to only have one transmission system.
Okay, so in provinces where you have Crown owned utilities, and so BC, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Quebec, and some of the maritime provinces, now you already have the system essentially in place. And would it be possible to then simply open up the power generation to private suppliers or
Yes,
private providers?
yeah, that's a market structure thing. In BC, we could open up where you bid on an hourly basis. Say BC Hydro could even do 80% of it. They just get 80% right up front. And then you have 20% of the market that's bid in, or the whole market gets bid in. We don't have the large number of private suppliers that are already sitting on the ground in Alberta waiting to provide power, where we have just BC Hydro plus a bunch of long-term contracts. But that doesn't prevent us in BC from going forward that the BC government's mandates that all new power supply has to be auctioned, say, on an hourly basis, and they're open to independent wind providers. It could be pulp mills selling their extra power. It could be solar, what have you, and it's all balanced through an arm's length agent. It's all balanced through an arm's length agency that handles the hourly auctions.
Now, what about in provinces like Manitoba and Quebec, where, well, let's take Quebec, because the Quebec Hydro has actually undertaken a couple of wind farms, for example. I mean, they understand that wind and solar are now the cheapest form of electricity, and they see the benefit of using their hydro dams as almost a form of battery
Exactly.
for that intermittent. So in that case, could the Crown-owned utility simply do their own wind and solar farms?
Yes, they could. Absolutely. Now, there's a key element to this that, coming back to our talking about having to, if we're going to electrify much of the economy, the private market, it's hard for them to anticipate. It's government policy that's driving electrification of the transport fleet. It's government policy that's driving electrification of buildings and eventually industry. So if it's government policy driving that broad, clean electrification of the economy, that has to be passed through in the anticipated planning in the electricity sector. So you effectively do need some sort of entity that's telling the private market that we anticipate on a 1, 2, 5, 10-year horizon, we're going to need this much more electricity that we want you to bid in to supply to us under the system you're describing. So say in Quebec, they've got so many dams, it could be Hydro-Quebec that just builds the extra windmills and solar and what have you, and they've been quite effective at doing that in the past, or they could run a separate private competition for the extra power that they need.
Okay, so what is the most efficient low-cost model here? Is it the Crown Corporation that does its own renewable energy development, or is it like Alberta, where that part of where power generation is essentially privatized and there's a market? Which one might be the best model for Canadian provinces?
That's an excellent question. And to a certain extent, it depends on the province and the quality of the governance of the large utility. If you've got a large, well-functioning utility that knows how to run internal competitions well for the new power, what have you, go ahead, just do it within the utility. But Alberta has taken another path, and it said, no, we're going to trust this private sector to do that. We'll set the parameters that they operate in. We'll govern the larger market, but they will tell us what the price will. They'll bid in, and that's how we'll get the price. The system works quite well, and it looks like it's working quite well in expanding as it needs to. A lot of this depends on the quality of governance within the provincial institutions that govern electricity.
Okay, let's get back to the wires for a moment. If we need 2 to 3 times as much electricity by 2050, that means we need to expand the wires, both the transmission and the distribution side. How is that going? What's the most efficient model there to do the expansion? Should government own them, or should the an arm's length agency own them, or should the private sector own them and be regulated by the regulator?
No, that's an excellent question. So the transmission system, as it grows, it's a natural monopoly, one way or the other. It's going to have to be governed as a natural monopoly through the Provincial Utilities Commission to make sure that they're, both generators and users of power get a fair deal, and we get clean electrification happening well. Now, as it expands, what will likely happen in BC is it will probably be on BC Hydro to expand it, but that for BC Hydro to do that well, that it needs to be in its mandate to serve clean electrification in the province. So that needs to be in the Utilities Commission mandate. And all these things are governed by the province, right, at the provincial level. So you do need, if you're going to do this utility, large utility-based version, as we seem to be doing in BC, you need very coherent direction at the provincial level, at the Utilities Commission level, and for direction to BC Hydro going forward. And that's a fairly complicated planning exercise. Alberta will likely do something different where, okay, so we have a national regulation saying we're going to have electrification of vehicles. So they know there's a fleet of electric vehicles coming. You're going to have net zero building codes, what have you. They know more power is coming down the line. So it's going to have to be an integrated dance with the AESO, and the province may have to provide much of the capital, the borrowing power of the AESO, but it'll probably be AESO that contracts for the building of that new transmission.
Gotcha. So if I could sum up, we'll see if I get it right. In provinces like British Columbia, the extra power generation could be contracted out, or the Crown Corporation utility could do it internally, depending on what they feel comfortable with and what kind of internal engineering capacity they have to do those kinds of projects. On the wires side of things, the transmission and distribution, those should always be a natural monopoly, whether it's owned by the Crown, by the government owned utility, or if it's an independent system operator, as it is in Alberta. Right?
Yes.
So I've kind of got that right. And so those are I think we've sketched out the broad parameters of how the Canadian electricity system needs to expand, and who needs to own it, who needs to regulate it, and so on. And are we doing a good job of it?
Well, that's a $1 trillion question, isn't it? I would argue no, we're not. Our utility across it's not, as far as I know, it's not yet baked into the mandates for both the BC Utilities Commission and BC Hydro that they are empowered and encouraged to do clean electrification, and that they're required to get to net zero, and that has to come as a provincial mandate. And we can go literally province by province and do an assessment. With Quebec probably being in the very best position, they've got the best governance and the best sort of institutional structure for getting done what we're describing at this point in time, and even right down to the point of how do the gas and electricity markets interact through time. And Quebec's already anticipated that. I think we have good high-level federal directionality on net zero, and the provinces are doing okay. But how this translates down at the governance of the electricity system and the gas system, we're not there yet. There's a whole lot of work that needs to be done in order to prepare, the grid for a lot of EV charging, a lot of buildings going electric, a lot of gas, a lot of buildings going off of gas through time and going electric. We're not there yet. There's a decade, 2 decades of work that needs to be done that's barely even anticipated. Would be my call at this point in time. But I'd be happy to debate that with anybody.
Now, just before I let you go, Chris, one final question, and that is, we haven't spent a lot of time in Ontario, but I've interviewed experts like Professor Mark Winfield at York University, who argue pretty convincingly that Ontario's electricity system is broken. And so the ideas that we've talked about today, how do they apply to Ontario?
Ontario is its own beast. They've gone through many different attempts at market reforms and patched up market reforms since the 1990s. And it's very easy for politicians or those politically interested to point at any one point of failure in the Ontario electricity system for why their prices are so high. But really, it's a cascading series of challenges that really the system should be rebuilt from the governance system, the transition system, and the planning for the generation and for clean electrification. That should be all rebuilt from the bottom up. But whether or not that's a huge political project that require a lot of political capital and financial capital going forward. And I don't know if we're anywhere near that in Ontario at this point in time.
Well, Chris, thank you very much. You've shone some light on what I think is probably one of the top 5 energy issues for Canada going forward. Really appreciate your insights.
My pleasure, Markham.